Okay, Sarah, Tiffany, Carly.
Hi.
Are you guys all there?
Hello, good afternoon.
Everyone is there. Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is Patty Flusher with America's Newspapers, and thank you for joining us on our webinar today. Just a few housekeeping items. I know many of you have participated in our webinars in the past, so you know that you will be muted on the call. That always also keeps the webinar quiet and free from people walking in your office and talking to you, or phones ringing and that sort of thing. Secondly, you will get a copy of the slides that you are seeing that both Sarah and Tiffany will present today. So those will come in something called the webinar takeaways. We produce the webinar takeaways, which are notes, summaries of everything you heard on the call today. Carly Lintz, one of the writers with America's Newspapers, will be doing those takeaways. And lastly, after the webinar, you will also be getting a survey. It's about 3 questions and should take you about 25 seconds to do. So we really appreciate it if you would, and give us some feedback on the program today. So given that, I am going to turn the program over to, I'm not sure which one of you is starting, but we have Sarah Hartland and Tiffany Kelly with Lineup Systems, and I'm going to turn the program over to them and we'll get started. Sarah, Tiffany.
Thanks, Patty.
Thank you.
So just to give you guys a little bit of visual, or audio rather, distinction in our voices, I'm Sarah Hartland. I'm the marketing manager for the North American region here at Lineup Systems.
And I'm Tiffany Kelly. I'm the digital product manager at Lineup. I actually started as the digital deployment consultant for North America. So working with publishers on AdPoint project launches.
Yeah, exactly. Before we get into it, I think Lineup's probably a bit new to some of you in the audience. So I do just want to give a short background, just because we will mention a couple times throughout customers here and there, and it's helpful to know what that context is. So we work with multi-channel publishers from all over the world, newspapers, magazines, a few digital-only companies. And each one has a slightly different way of structuring their ad sales teams. So some are multi-channel, where a sales rep might sell print and digital and events and all the channels as an individual sales rep, sell across everything, while others still divide up, their print team, their digital sales team, their events team. And what we noticed from our work with companies all over the world is that often when the digital and print teams are separate, as is often the case, the digital teams can kind of end up in their own little world. They have their acronyms and their tech speak, and if you don't come from a digital background, or you don't have time to read all of the ad tech blogs, this can feel a little bit intimidating. I noticed several of you, from looking at the attendee registrations, several of you have digital in your titles, so you probably know what I'm talking about. On the other hand, we've seen teams that put a little extra effort into bridging the gap between print and digital perform really well and just operate with less stress and frustration in general. So Tiffany and I, along with several other digital subject matter experts at Lineup, put together this digital advertising trends glossary earlier this year, just to cover the most common confusing terms. And it quickly became one of our most popular resources, which is how we ended up in front of all of you today. Patty reached out to us and thought it was a helpful little resource. So you'll all get a copy at the end of the webinar, and as just a special little bonus for you guys, we've actually put together a second guide that's just programmatic terms. It has a few that aren't in this original document, and you'll be the first ones to get that. So that'll be helpful too, because programmatic terms are changing all the time, as we'll discuss. So these are online, you can search them. You can also print them out if you prefer. They're fully indexed. So with that in mind, just some context to set up our discussion. I promise we're not going to sit here and read you definitions. In fact, we're mostly going to focus on why these terms matter and how to get on the same page across your entire organization. Some of these terms that we're going to discuss, we have additional resources we can point you towards for continued discussion. But the presentation itself will have definitions for you to read. And of course, we welcome your questions. I'm not sure if we'll get to them in between or all at the end, but please send us your questions. We can always rewind and go back to a definition if there's confusion or some discussion points around it. I think that covers all of the background and housekeeping. Anything to add, Tiffany?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay, perfect. Well, with all that said, let's get into it. We'll start with a simple one.
Yes, sounds very simple.
A for above the fold.
I'm sure you're all familiar with above the fold.
Yeah, so why do we start off with this term that's kind of simple to begin with, easing into it?
So above the fold, in my case for digital, is essentially anything visible as soon as a website loads without scrolling further down the screen. But above the fold can apply to content, it can apply to print, so right. It has various meanings.
Right, so we're going to get harder from here, I promise. But we wanted to start off with above the fold as an easy example of how digital borrows terms from print. This is really an exact one-to-one example of this. So for those of you who are on the print side of the audience or the digital novices among us, don't get too intimidated. We will get into some more challenging terms after this. In fact, I think the next one is, but this is just to say there's more in common than you think, and I think that's worth pointing out. But escalating quickly, moving on to blockchain. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to read this full definition, Tiffany, or even explain to us too technically what blockchain is, but you had a great analogy for describing this and how it relates to digital advertising.
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely not going to get into the technical details of blockchain or Bitcoin mining or anything like that. But just to explain it simply, I'll explain the problem it solves rather than going into the technical details. And then if you have questions at the end, or you can feel free to reach out to me directly over email. But so for example, I live in Scottsdale and Sarah lives in Denver. We both really want to see a concert at Red Rocks in Denver in a few months, and tickets go on sale Friday at 10 a.m., but I'm in meetings all day. So Sarah finds time to purchase the tickets, and on the way to my next meeting, I call my bank and I ask them to transfer the money to her. So essentially, I'm trusting this third party, and it's a really simple transaction that should really take place between two people. But we're trusting these third parties all of the time. So that's where blockchain comes in. And it's essentially a database that's validated by a wider community rather than a central authority or a bank or a government.
So blockchain has been in discussion in the tech world for a while now. You mentioned Bitcoin, but how does it specifically relate to digital advertising?
Well, one example would be it could allow for something like self-enforcing smart contracts for creators like musicians or journalists. Instead of giving away free songs or articles, a system could generate automatic micropayments for every stream or every article read, direct from the consumers, like the readers, direct to the content creators, without the middlemen like Spotify or Facebook.
Okay, so in its simplest form, blockchain just is working to remove the middlemen in all sorts of different environments. So I think it's fair to say we could do an entire webinar on blockchain. So we'll move on for now. But as Tiffany mentioned, happy to answer questions or point you toward additional resources on this one. It's not going away anytime soon. Now to get back to a little bit of a less intimidating term, if my slide will work, is campaign. So before we jump into this one, we had a little bit of a debate amongst ourselves here of whether to include campaign, and the reason why I wanted to keep it in this lineup of terms is not because it's a complicated term or because most of you won't know what it is, but because it can mean different things in different contexts, even within the same teams. In fact, a great example, because I handle our digital marketing here at Lineup, and Tiffany has a digital advertising background and is in product. When I say campaign, I mean a marketing campaign that's centered around a specific topic or goal. But when Tiffany says campaign, what would you mean by campaign, for an example, Tiffany?
For example, Macy's Thanksgiving Day campaign. That could mean one order with one digital display ad, for example. Or that campaign could include a newsletter, a pre-roll video, sponsored content, a Facebook post. So it's essentially a series of integrated advertising messages that share the same theme.
Right, so it's specific to advertising. And then, you know, when we get into the usage of the term in, say, AdPoint, which is the advertising order management system that Lineup created, campaign can have some different nuances there. So we didn't include it to give you the definition of what a campaign is. We included it just as a quick reminder that what you mean when you refer to some terms might not be exactly what your teammate means. And so sometimes it's helpful to back up for a second and just define what you're talking about. So that's why we kept it in here, just for that quick comment. But we have one more C letter term, cookies. This is a big one, and I think it's a big one not so much in terms of what a cookie is, but why we're still talking about cookies so much. And I know you have some great commentary on that, Tiffany.
Sure. Well, first, what a cookie is, it's just a bit of data sent from a website and stored on a user's computer by their web browser as they're browsing the internet. So cookies store information on user visits and activity. They set your language preference, store login information. They ensure products you've added to your shopping cart stay there as you continue shopping. So they aren't entirely bad. The issue with cookies today is, and I'm not sure if you all read any ad tech blogs or have seen in recent news, that the death of the cookie, or you know, the death of RTB, which we'll also get into. But essentially, due to GDPR and other data privacy regulation laws, which we will also touch on, the cookie, especially the third-party cookie, which is used for cross-site tracking, retargeting, and ad serving, is predicted to go away in the near future.
Okay, so I think to sum it up, cookies were something that digital advertisers could rely on for a long time, whether they were high quality or not, and that's a whole discussion. But we're having to find more creative ways to track individuals' activity on the web, and I know we're going to get into some examples of that, but worth touching on for sure. And we've got a lot of additional resources, which we'll mention throughout, that touch on the death of the cookie and getting around that. And man, I know we could go on and on, but
Yeah.
I do want to queue up the next one here, because we mentioned, and I loved the write-up that America's Newspapers did on our subject matter here, the acronyms. The acronyms in digital advertising can be overwhelming. And so this next one is our first acronym, DSP.
So DSP, or demand side platform, not slide. We're just making sure you're all paying attention. But slide. So as a buyer, for example, in my previous role before Lineup, I worked at an ad agency specific to Honda and Acura, and I was the media buyer and strategist. So our DSP, or demand side platform, was the trade desk, and I would use the trade desk to purchase various types of inventory, whether that be direct to publishers, but it could be display, video, native. I would even purchase Hulu and Spotify inventory on behalf of Honda and Acura. So it's basically automating the buying process for the buy side.
So I hear demand, and I know we'll get into SSPs later, but I hear demand and I think of my Econ 101 class, supply and demand. Is that an accurate way to think of this? Meaning demand is when you want something, it's the buy side?
Yes,
Okay.
that's exactly what it is.
Okay, awesome. Speaking of acronyms, we've got another one that starts with D. We just wrote a piece on this one, data management platforms.
Yeah, so data management platforms, and this is a huge topic right now for publishers too, as the death of the cookie and requirements are changing due to the data regulation laws. They're looking for different types of DMPs or data management platforms with a different set of tools to manage their first-party data rather than just collecting third-party data. So a data management platform is basically just used for collecting and managing data, mainly for digital marketing purposes, but it allows publishers or anyone using it to generate audience or contextual segments, which are then used to target specific users in your various ad platforms like Facebook or Google Ad Manager.
So it's a tool to help you slice and dice and properly segment your audience?
Yep, properly segment your audience data so that you can use it for targeting typically.
Okay, cool. Can you give us a couple of examples of DMPs that we might recognize the names of?
Sure, there's Oracle's, BlueKai, Lotame, LiveRamp.
Okay. I don't know if those are ringing any bells for any of you. Coming from the digital marketing side of the table, I can tell you that this one is a new one for me. So we just wrote up a guide to data management platforms on our newsroom, which is just lineup.com/newsroom, where we talk about all sorts of things in digital advertising and the publishing industry in general. And in researching and writing and consulting for that piece, a lot of it was new to me, so it may be new to many of you as well. Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, the next one I know is one that you love to talk about, first-party data.
Yes, well, I love to talk about it just because it's such a huge topic right now, and I think it's really important to stay informed on first-party data and really have a great strategy for collecting first-party data, especially as a publisher. But first-party data is the information that you collect directly from your audience or your customers. So maybe subscribers through your website or people who sign up for your newsletter. When you're collecting their names or their email addresses, that's first-party data, and that's really valuable data to advertisers.
Right. And we'll talk about it in contrast with its, I don't know if it's fair to call them sister terms, but with third-party data and some of the controversy there. I don't know if you want to touch on that here, if you want to wait till we get into third-party data.
We'll wait till we get into third-party data because I think that that applies directly there.
Sure. Okay. Next one, acronym GDPR, and before you get into the significance of this, Tiffany, I do just want to mention for those of you that are paying extra attention and did just amazing in kindergarten, you're probably noticing that we're skipping around in terms of the alphabet, and that's simply for time purposes. We're not going to hit every single letter of the alphabet, so we did put these in alphabetical order, but if you're wondering, hey, you skipped a letter there, that's why. Okay, GDPR.
All right, so GDPR, well, the reason first-party data is so important is largely due to GDPR, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It was passed in May of 2016, but it actually went into effect in 2018. So it was established to give digital rights for citizens of the EU, and if you are a US company with a website and you receive traffic from European Union visitors, then GDPR absolutely does affect you. So a lot of times people in the US think, oh, it's the EU, it doesn't apply to me, but it absolutely does. If you work with any ad partner or vendor or anyone doing business in the EU, then it does apply. And GDPR set the stage for other consumer privacy acts, which is going on in California right now. And there is actually a new one in the EU called ePrivacy. And we have written a lot about that, and we can expand on that if anyone has any questions at the end or over email.
Yeah, and you mentioned the California Consumer Privacy Act. We didn't include that here, but we definitely have some projects in the works to kind of explain how that's going to impact the news industry. Lots of people are talking about it, but we have some customers specifically asking about it, and so stay tuned. More to come on data privacy, because the conversation is just getting started, I assure you. Okay, here the next one's a fun one too, identity. And this is less of a specific term. That's why we have tracking, management, and linking. It's kind of a nickname, you know, you refer to identity, and it could be in regards to any of these three things. But Tiffany, you talk about this a lot, even just internally. So what the heck is it? Why is it such a big part of conversation?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think I wrote about this about a year ago on our customer success portal, but identity is largely related to, and just as important as first-party data, and related to GDPR, but it's essentially people-based data. It's the concept of knowing who your targeting is. So identity resolution is basically just defined as the process of connecting unique identifiers or an identity, creating a single unified real-time customer identity so that you know who you're targeting in your marketing strategy. Right now in the industry, everyone is using a different method of attribution, or they have different sets of IDs for Facebook, Google, SSPs, DSPs. What the ad tech industry is currently trying to solve is a unified ID, so that the industry can track actual identities and across various platforms and devices and know who that person is.
So when I go to sign up for a new subscription service or just account that I want, and it gives me the option to log in with Facebook, that's a form of identity tracking, right?
Exactly. You want that people-based data so that you know the person you're targeting, their actual interests, offline, online behavior. And typically these are people who are opting in to receive advertising messages. Well, they should be anyway, if you want to be compliant with the data laws, but
right.
That's why it's so important too, is because they're open to receiving messaging.
So when we touched on cookies earlier, identity is sort of one of the answers to the death of the cookie. If we can't use cookie-based tracking, we need to be looking into ways to track a single individual hopefully across all of their devices, and build more or less a profile on them so that we can send them relevant messages. It's very cool. It borders in between being very cool and a touch creepy.
Yes, but cookies aren't reliable anyway. I mean, 2/3 of mobile devices don't support cookies. We live in a mobile-first world, so.
So it's really a positive thing that we're having to have the conversation around identity.
In my opinion, yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, definitely a challenge worth further discussion, but we have to move on. So this next one, lookalike audience. Is this something that is based on identity tracking? Is it based on cookie tracking? Explain to me what a lookalike audience is and how we build them.
Sure, so it could apply to both. So a lookalike audience is basically, a lookalike audience would be used for targeting within, take Google Ad Manager, for example. You want to build a lookalike audience based off of either your best existing customers or a targeting strategy you've used in the past that has performed really well. You want to build lookalike audiences in your new marketing campaigns so that way you know that they'll perform better. So if you have an audience that is maybe in-market auto intenders in the Denver DMA that performed really well for this campaign that you did last year at this time. So you want to build that lookalike audience using those same data segments within another platform maybe to try and get that great performance again.
Okay, so practically speaking, if you in Phoenix and me in Denver are both doing research on the Kia Sorento, I've been Googling it and looking at the pages on the Kia website, and separately you have as well, is lookalike audience based on activities like that, you know, behavior, or is it more based on, say, demographics that we're both women who are millennials and share, you know, a similar background? Which is it based off of typically?
Well, it could be either. So lookalike audience is just something that you're building, that you're building this audience based on something that you know has performed well in the past, whether that be someone who is, you know, was behavioral targeted, or it could just be demographically targeted. But you know that audience has performed well in the past, or it's similar to your best existing customers. So you're rebuilding those same data segments, whether that be any of those that you mentioned.
Got it.
So you're rebuilding that and then using that as another targeting strategy because you know it's going to perform well.
So ideally, using a lookalike audience over and over again would get you better and better results up to a certain point, of course.
Ideally, that's not always the case, but that's always the goal, of course.
Right. All right, multi-touch attribution. This is an interesting one.
Sure. So multiple points of attribution within the marketing sales journey before a user converts. So maybe they saw a commercial, they visited your website, then they were retargeted with a display ad across the web, and then they eventually ended up converting. So maybe they filled out an online form, if that's what you count as a conversion. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to know every single touch point and everything that influenced that user up until the point where they did make that conversion, because you want to be able to give credit to each of those advertisements and each of those different tactics. It's not just the last touch.
Right.
It's not just the last thing last message they saw before they made that conversion, that you have to give credit to all of them.
Right, so think of it in terms of just a human decision-making process. You're not just gonna sign on and buy a nice pair of shoes. You probably saw them in a magazine, or you saw your friend wearing them, or you saw yeah, there's a whole journey that leads you up to that last conversion. So multi-touch attribution is really interesting in terms of identity tracking, because obviously if you've got a good identity tracking scheme set up, it's much easier to have multi-touch attribution. And the other thing that comes to mind, we just published a piece about communicating campaign return on investment to your advertisers. So let's say you're in a sales team at a newspaper or a magazine, and your advertiser customer comes to you and they say, okay, we ran this expensive multi-channel campaign with you. We purchased XYZ print space and this many impressions on digital. What did that deliver for us? And the conversation of return on investment, because oftentimes, especially in terms of print and certain digital campaigns, you're not going to get last touch attributions from those. But they are helping along the journey that leads to a purchase. And if you can demonstrate that, you're ultimately showing your value to advertisers, and that's what keeps them coming back for more. So I love the conversation surrounding multi-touch attribution, but it's one of those things that's, I think we all agree that we need to do it. The how can be tricky, so perhaps we'll dive into that in the future, Tiffany, because I know there's a lot to dig into here.
Yes, it's not as easy as it sounds.
Right.
Sarah, Tiffany, this is Patty. So
Hi.
as we're going through all these terms, I keep trying to think of little stories that would help me understand them, and you guys are doing a great job of that. But for multi-touch attribution, I decided it's like opening up a jar that you can't get open, right? You try to open it, and then somebody else tries, and then the third person finally opens it, and they say, Bill did it. Bill's the one. That's why it got open. But it's really all the people that loosened the jar beforehand.
Exactly.
That's a great one, Patty. Yeah, that's definitely what I told my dad as a kid. So we've all been there. No, that's exactly it. I definitely think there's so much to say about multi-touch attribution, and this is one that if you can, whether you're coming from the print side or the digital side, if you can wrap your head around this concept and explain it well to advertisers, it's going to serve you really well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm trying to understand all this, and I love all the stories you guys are telling because I think it's helpful. So continue on.
Good, yes, and if anyone has other examples or things that they want to shoot into the comments, happy to read through those, because this is not a one and done thing. So thanks for reminding me to say this, Patty. But it's not as simple as, okay, I'm going to watch this webinar and download these terms, and then I will understand digital. I wish it was that simple. I think many of us do. But the truth of it is, you've got to return to these, and the most effective way is to have conversations around these terms, not just this is the word for word definition, but how does it apply to your business, having those conversations with your digital team. Remember when we talked about campaign and how it can mean something different to different people, having those conversations, but also the thing about digital, it's always changing. So I joke sometimes I started in search engine optimization in 2012, and it's pretty much all different now, and really in the grand scheme of things it hasn't been that long. And Tiffany, when we talk about our editorial calendar for the newsroom, you write our digital specific blog posts, and I can't tell you all how many times it's happened where we have something in the calendar and then Tiffany on Monday morning or Tuesday morning before her thing goes, oh, but this is what people are talking about now. This is what matters now. It moves really fast. So we've tried to bring you up to speed with some basics, but definitely dig back into the recording, flip back through this slideshow, and use these as conversation starters, because the more you lend some tangibility to it, the more useful it'll be.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to note.
Yeah. So speaking of things that sound easier than they are, native advertising.
Native advertising. So native advertising has been popular for quite a few years now, but it's essentially digital advertising that works as part of the main flow of your content. So it looks and feels like your website's content. And then typically when you click on a native ad, you'll be taken to a sponsored content article. But one fun fact about native advertising, and one sort of misconception, is that ad blockers don't affect native advertising. But the truth is, if you are using a third-party native partner such as Taboola or TripleLift or ShareThrough, and they ask you to put third-party code for that placement on your website, then ad blockers will absolutely block those ads.
Right. So would the traditional way to get around that be, I guess there's some, we had this conversation, I think, in one of our run-throughs about whether sponsored content is native advertising, and I think what we concluded is sponsored content is native advertising, but native advertising is not necessarily sponsored content. But
yeah, this is one of those tricky ones.
But sponsored content wouldn't be affected by an ad blocker. It's more if it's like programmatically traded native advertising that would be affected by ad blockers.
So if you mean sponsored content as in an article written maybe for a brand, and it is meant to be an article as a marketing message. The article itself wouldn't get blocked, but the actual ad that you are seeing that fits within, maybe the content blocks of your website, that ad would be blocked if you are using any third-party code on your website.
Got it. So
I
I
would
think
use to generate that ad.
Oh, okay, got it. I think there's some really interesting research coming out about like the effectiveness of native advertising. But yeah, we have to be clear on what you mean by what your native advertising offerings are. And perhaps some of you have some creative ways of offering native or sponsored content to your advertisers, and I'd love to hear some of what you all are doing, because there's a lot of really creative ways in events and in print to offer what is basically amounts to native. So that's an interesting one. Okay, I was trying to not mention it ahead of its time, but I did mention the P word, programmatic. This one is fun. Tiffany, why don't you give us a rundown on what programmatic is, but especially why it's so significant?
Sure. So programmatic is just buying and selling of online ad inventory in an automated method. So it's using technology to buy and sell ads rather than the traditional way with manual IOs and tons of invoices. And real-time bidding, RTB, is one form of programmatic, but one misconception is that that's all programmatic is. But there's programmatic direct, which if any of you use Google Ad Manager, there's programmatic guaranteed, preferred deals, private auctions. There's various forms of advertising, of programmatic advertising, various definitions between different platforms. So getting these terms down is difficult, and they do change quite a bit. For example, Google Ad Manager just changed exchange bidding, their header bidding solution, to open bidding.
Right.
I don't know why, but they decided to do that.
Well, that's actually one of the questions I had is because terms in this space change so much, and we know that they change so frequently, who's leading those changes? Is it the ad tech companies? Is it Google? Like, who gets to decide what a header is called?
Most of the time it's Google. They're rebranding their whole programmatic direct solution after the DSM sunset. But yeah, it essentially is the ad tech or the platforms that are leading those changes.
Interesting. Well, like it or not, I guess when you're the market leader, you get to influence the vocabulary. But with that in mind, because honestly, there's so many programmatic specific terms that we could have talked about. That's why we did the spin-off glossary that all of you will get. It's a really good refresher on the current programmatic terms. We'll probably have to update it, truth be told, fairly frequently. But it's good to have front of mind, what the core terminology is, and then also have a little notification when a term changes, just to be aware that, these two terms really mean the same thing. But at its most basic level, programmatic is just selling advertising with machines rather than human interaction, yes?
Yes, there's some human interaction when it comes to programmatic guaranteed, but that's one of the benefits of it. It's still automated by technology. There's still buyers and sellers communicating in a one-to-one method, and you're still buying that premium inventory at the same rates. But yeah, so there's still some human interaction, but it's definitely automated with the technology.
Okay, so I just want to toot your horn for a second here, Tiffany, because AdPoint can now push programmatic guaranteed ad buys through our OMS, which is a lot of jargon to me. I'm slowly learning exactly what that means. But let me tell you all, when Tiffany talks programmatic, she knows her stuff. And I really encourage you to check out the guide that she's created, because I can basically boil it down to it's using machines to sell advertising and buy advertising. That's about the extent of my true understanding, but constantly learning from the things that Tiffany tells me are important. I believe her, and I try to dig in and understand these terms, and I think that's important. Even if you're in print, even if you never sell programmatically, I think it's worth taking a step back to understand. So one of those terms, and you kind of covered this already, but it is next, is RTB. So let's touch on it.
Sure. RTB, or real-time bidding, is just advertisers bidding on individual ad impressions in real time. So the buying takes place through these online exchanges or marketplaces, and which connect the publishers and the advertisers, the DSPs and SSPs, as we mentioned. And they're bidding on inventory, and whoever pays the highest for that ad impression will get to have their ad shown, and they'll secure that ad impression.
Right. You mentioned that this is sort of going away, falling out of favor. Why is that?
Because a lot of RTB, if you're not careful, doesn't necessarily comply with GDPR or CCPA. That's why we're seeing a shift in RTB to programmatic direct, because you can still automate and take advantage of the technology of, like I said, there's no manual IOs. With programmatic guaranteed, you have one invoice per month for all of your advertisers. So it really speeds things up, and it's completely compliant with GDPR and CCPA.
Got it. And just to bring us full circle here, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but is the reason it's not compliant with CCPA and GDPR because it's cookie based?
Well, it uses a lot of third-party data, a lot of third-party cookies. So essentially, yes, that would be the reason.
Okay, see, I'm trying to use these questions for those of you listening to just like bring these full circle, because they all relate, and the way that we structured this is not necessarily in categories of related terms like the glossary is, but it was more in alphabetical order. So I'm just trying to connect the dots a little bit. Speaking of connecting the dots, SSPs. So this relates to, this is the other side of those DSPs that we mentioned at the beginning, right?
Yes, so this is for inventory sellers, so publishers, for example. Google Ad Manager includes Google Ad Exchange, which is an SSP. So it's the technology that connects to buyers, where publishers can sell their inventory to buyers in an automated fashion.
So you mentioned Google Ad Manager. Are there other popular SSPs that our audience right now might recognize, or is that the main one?
Yeah, I mean, there's AppNexus, which recently changed their name to, I believe, they just rebranded. There's OpenX, there's Index Exchange, there's Rubicon, there's many
Right.
SSPs.
Well, I know that before you were our digital product manager and you were working as a deployment consultant with hands on the ground, boots on the ground with a lot of our customers, we integrate with a lot of SSPs. So I'm sure you know better than most that there's a lot of them, but they all essentially do or serve the same function. So yeah, once again, supply and demand is your clue for telling the difference between a DSP and an SSP. Speaking of related terms, and you mentioned this when we were talking about RTB, third-party data. Okay, small definition, but man, big topic right now.
Yes, so it's unlike first-party data, which again was the data that you collect directly from your consumers. third-party data is bought from outside sources who are not the original collectors of that data. For example, if you don't have enough first-party data to run a specific audience segment that you'd like to run or your advertiser would like to run, then you'd probably use your DMP to buy third-party data and use one of their segments to add on to your campaign and fulfill that request.
So it's a little bit of a shortcut.
It's a shortcut, and the thing with third-party data is scale, right? That's the value it provides, but that's really it, because a lot of the times you don't know where that third-party data is coming from. You don't know how recent it is. You don't know how often these third parties are updating and scrubbing that data. It could be, they could have been in-market auto intenders, as I used that example earlier, 3 years ago. But so you always want to ask your third-party data partners and providers those types of questions. How recent is it? Is it GDPR compliant, CCPA compliant? Where their data is coming from, and how often they scrub that data.
Got it. I think that one of the pieces you mentioned working on is a list of questions to evaluate those third-party data sources. So that would be a good follow-up piece as well. Okay, nearing the end here, letter V, viewable. This is an interesting one.
Viewable. So an ad is determined viewable if it's actually seen by a user, but there's different standards set by different groups. For example, Group M's definition is that 100% of a display's ad's pixels must be in view for more than 1 second. And then for video, it's viewable if 100% of the video is in view for at least 50% of the duration of the video. And
Those
then for IAB,
pretty...
they have less strict standards, but
right,
yeah.
I was going to say this Group M example seems like a pretty tough standard, which is honestly pretty good. So we didn't include a definition for impressions, but just to clarify the difference between an impression and a viewable ad, like an impression is if it shows up on the screen, and viewable is if a person sees it based on some standard that you set to determine that.
Yeah, there's different viewability partners that publishers could use. Google Ad Manager comes with Google's viewability tool, which is called ActiveView, but there's also Moat, for example, is another one. So Group M, even though they have such high standards, they can, and people will pay higher rates for that. For example, we have customers who have their preset default rates just for Group M's viewability standards, and you know, whether they buy 100,000 impressions on their website, if they have to deliver 800,000 impressions to ensure that every single impression delivered was 100% viewable, then they're going to do that. But also those VCPMs, those rates for those types of campaigns are double, triple sometimes.
Right, so back to the discussion about communicating ROI to your advertisers, understanding the significance of viewability, it would be another great way to explain the value of your offering to an advertiser. All right, we've reached the end, but let's touch on briefly walled gardens. It's not Z, well, it's not the letter Z.
So walled gardens are, we know the walled gardens as Facebook, Google, and Amazon. So they're basically the tech giants, and they work in a closed ecosystem, and all operations are controlled by them. So it's essentially a gated community that restricts the kind of people that get in by having clearly defined boundary walls on and guarded entrances. So basically whatever Facebook says goes, whatever Google says goes when you're using their products.
Right, so in most instances, the walled gardens. It's kind of a negative term, or it talks to the frustration that publishers have with these big tech platforms, and rightly so. Okay, well, we've reached the end here. I do briefly want to mention, just reiterate what I talked about earlier on about our newsroom. So throughout, as we've said, oh, we have a resource on this, or we just wrote about this. Lineup just launched about 8 weeks ago now our Lineup newsroom. It's lineup.com/newsroom. Pretty easy to remember. And that's our publishing blog. So this is very industry focused. I promise you're not going to go on here and find a bunch of press releases or sales pitches. We really are talking about industry topics here. And we have, I think we did the math once, like 700 years of combined media experience at Lineup. And so in recognition of that, we wanted to start sharing what we've learned from working with publishers all over the world in a format that was accessible and free, and hopefully useful. And so there's a couple examples here, but I'm thinking also of a piece on competing with big tech, the walled gardens, a lot of the topics that we talked about today. There's more information there, so that's a quick place to go for follow-ups. But that said, we've reached the end. We can take a few questions now, comments or anything like that.
So this is Patty. My first question to everybody on the call is, who wants to have Tiffany and Sarah on direct dial phone a friend? I would. Phone a
That's
text
completely
friend.
okay with me.
Phone a text friend, yes. That was. I'm going to be straight up and say I am not a digital expert I'm not a digital anything, okay? Forget expert. But I learned a lot, because there are things that you talked about that I always wondered, I don't really understand that. So I think we could have done this all day long. Oh, somebody on the webinar says, I want them on a phone a text friend.
Awesome.
So it's clear that I'm sure there are people, I think you noted when we started the webinar that there were several different digital titles and such given the folks that are on the webinar today. And so, but I can't believe that they didn't learn something. So this was great. Secondly, I wanted to bring up the programmatic guide that you spoke about, Sarah. I think it was Sarah. I think you mentioned that along with the other terms that they would be able to get the programmatic guide for participating. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand?
No, that's absolutely correct. So we'll share the two links. They're not links to forms, they're links directly to the documents. So don't worry about having to go through another gate. But there's the link to the guide that some of you I've seen have already downloaded, but then there's the programmatic specific guide. It looks very similar, but it's only programmatic terms. Regarding phone a friend, Tiffany and I are very involved in the management of lineup.com. So worst comes to worst, push comes to shove, that contact us button goes to both of our inboxes, and we do respond to those as quickly as we possibly can. So feel free to reach out. This is what we're passionate about, and I love that there's an interest in the subject. So
great. And then the last thing, I mentioned to you folks on the call that you would get an evaluation form, and I really encourage you to fill that out. But specifically, if you would leave suggestions for other webinars that you think would be helpful, whether it's in this same area, whether it's additional topics in this same area. Let us know what you need. Let us know what you think will help you. That's what we're here for. That's what America's Newspapers is for. We're here to serve all of you as our members. So help us out and tell us what you need, and we'll do our best to deliver it. I would like to give one last shout out to anyone. If you have any questions, I kept writing down terms that I needed you to go back and talk about, but then you would keep talking, and then I would figure it out. Not to say that I can't use another lesson in identifiers, so that's one thing I'll have to learn more about.
Yes,
I don't.
no, so many spin-off topics.
Yeah, and I could talk about that all day, so feel free to give me a call.
I don't see any other questions, and so I definitely want to thank both Sarah and Tiffany so much for your time and your expertise. I'm very impressed with, and so I appreciate you sharing it with our audience today, and I appreciate you taking the time to do so. With that, I will say thank you, and we appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who participated on the webinar. I hope you found it helpful.
Awesome.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much
Patty.
for having us. Bye-bye.
Take care. Absolutely.